Further ado, again, we're very fortunate to have Marv Truhe here in a very important topic. I can remember when this occurred back in '72, I think, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, Marv, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, and thank you for the Veterans Museum. I've attended quite a few of these talks, so I've got a tough act to follow, but I just wanted to let you know that I appreciate all of you turning out today, especially this group of veterans. This is the first time I've talked to a group of veterans like this. The book just came out a month ago, but I've given a few presentations in the metro Denver area. But for me, this is a special group, and I appreciate that. We're going to talk about the book. Like I said, it was just released last month in October, Against All Tides, The Untold Story of the USS Kitty Hawk Race Riot. And as Mike mentioned, this took place in October of 1972, 50 years ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in the book. I'll read some excerpts from it. I'll tell you how the book came about, and then even during my talk, I would really invite comments or questions that you might have. I think that's more interesting for most people. Definitely we'll have some time afterwards to answer some questions. It's a story about racial injustices that occurred against black crew members of the USS Kitty Hawk at a time that it was conducting flight operations off the coast of North Vietnam, about 75 miles east of Haiphong Harbor. I know some of you folks here are Navy, and I know some of you I've talked to were actually served on board carriers. Well, I'm a shore-based landlubber, so some of the things that I'm going to talk about here you'll have more knowledge about than I do. But of course, in writing the book, I'm writing to a general audience, and so there are a lot of things in the book that made pretty basic explanations about the Kitty Hawk, about the Vietnam War, for those people who weren't around at the time to experience what it was like back here and so forth. The evening of the incident, which was October 12th, there were 6 hours of interracial confrontations between black and white crew members. And when it was over, there were 51 crew members who were seriously injured, to the extent that they had to have medical reports issued. 3 of them had to be flown off of the carrier for post-surgery. And there were dozens more that had been injured that never had medical reports. So it was a big deal. It's a first-person account because at the time I was a JAG lieutenant serving at the Law Center in San Diego at the 11th Naval District. I'd been in about 2 years at that point. And when the incident was over, they began on-board investigation. Now, unfortunately, the investigation was very one-sided, and my book talks about that one-sided investigation. And as a result, 2 weeks after the incident, there were 25 black crew members charged with rioting and assaults, and not a single white sailor was charged. Now, that alone ought to get your attention, because it was 6 hours of interracial confrontations. When the defendants were flown back to the naval station at San Diego Harbor, I was one of half a dozen defense counsel that was representing them. I represented 6 of them, as it turned out. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit, well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about my background. I'm a farm kid from South Dakota. And I was born during the last year of World War II. I had a friend who was giving me a bad time about being a first-time author at my age. And I pointed out to him that I was a year younger than Grandma Moses when she started her painting career. So actually, I'm fairly young for this project. After 4 years in the Navy, returned to South Dakota, my home state, with my wife, Nikki, back here in the back corner, and our son and our grandson back here. And I was first with the South Dakota Attorney General's office as an assistant attorney general, and then I spent 30 years practicing law in Rapid City. And then we retired in 2008. We came to Colorado, actually Nikki's home state, to be closer to our son Eric's family and our grandchildren. A little bit about the Kitty Hawk and my involvement in getting this book written. During the time of the trials, and they lasted for several months, they were individual trials, not a group trial, and they lasted from January to April of 1973. Even at the time they were ongoing, there were so many racial injustices that are occurring that I knew I had to tell this story at some point. So I began collecting original source documents. And we're talking about investigative reports, trial and hearing transcripts, my own records, my files, representing witnesses, conversations, interviews with my clients. And another thing I did that turned out to be very fortuitous is that every evening after the trials, I began dictating into a cassette recorder my personal recollections. And those came in very handy. Now, I had planned to finish the book within a few years after returning to South Dakota, but it took me 49 years. And that's a story in itself. My wife can attest to the fact that I had 6 banker boxes, thousands of original source documents that I carried around from home to home over those decades. And finally, in January of last year, I started writing the book. In addition to what was part of my individual collection, Congress actually began some hearings in San Diego prior to the trials beginning, and those records of those hearings are also available, this time online. But just as the investigations were one-sided, those hearings, closed-door hearings, were very one-sided. They were only interviewing senior naval officers and white crew members. There were only 2 exceptions in which they interviewed black crew members. Now keep in mind, we're talking about interracial confrontations. And as a result, they also came up with a very one-sided story. My first of my excerpts I'm going to read has to do with the report that Congressional subcommittee issued in January of 1973, actually the day before my first trial began. And the timing was very unfortunate because of the fact we were just starting our first trial. But here's what they said, quote, "The subcommittee is of the position that the riot on Kitty Hawk consisted of unprovoked assaults by a very few men, most of whom were below average mental capacity, most of whom had been aboard for less than 1 year, and all of whom were black. This group as a whole acted as thugs, which raises doubt as to whether they should ever have been accepted into military service in the first place." Now, my comment that I make after quoting that Congressional subcommittee is this: virtually every assertion in that statement is pure fiction. And that's what my book is about, to set the record straight. And when I say the untold story, that's exactly what I mean. It was very important for me from the very beginning that my book have integrity, that it be honest, that it be unbiased. I was critical, and am critical, of the investigations, and it would hardly be proper for me to write a one-sided book. It could have been a one-sided rant by a disgruntled defense lawyer, and I didn't want it to be that. And so I lay out all of the details from both sides, not only the assaults by the white sailors, but the assaults by the black sailors. When I started in the Navy, I was fresh out of law school. At that point, we had Naval Justice School in Newport, Rhode Island, before I reported for duty in San Diego. And to give you a little flavor of the book, it's not all serious. It's a very serious book. But I wanted to give a little broader perspective of what it was like to be a naval officer during that period of time. Keep in mind, a shore-based officer. And this is from the first chapter of the book. This is the first day that I report for duty. San Diego was sunny that morning, just like most mornings, when I drove up to the Law Center in my 1962 blue and white Chevrolet Impala. The Law Center was a quiet, nondescript one-deck structure that looked over the San Diego harbor. As I pulled up, I noticed a large steel gray Navy vessel at the chair just beyond the palm trees on the front lawn. Although I was a U.S. Navy officer, I didn't have a clue what kind of vessel it was. It was probably because I hadn't paid much attention to such things during Naval Officer Indoctrination School. Every ship has a hull classification code, and many of you, I'm sure here, know all about that. DE is a destroyer escort, LST, a landing ship tank, and so on for more than 100 codes. We were supposed to memorize them, but for a bunch of soon-to-be Navy lawyers, we didn't see much point. And OIS classmates simplified it for us all by calling them GBBs and LBBs, great big boats and little bitty boats. After looking again at the vessel berthed across from the Law Center, I figured it must be a GBB. Now, the carrier US Kitty Hawk was one of 7 with the 7th Fleet that had been deployed to the Westpac. And it's a large ship, almost a quarter-mile long. It has a flight deck of over 4 acres. And the crew complement at the time was about 4,500, and that included the embarked air squadrons. And they were about evenly split between the air squadrons and the permanent crew of the Kitty Hawk. Now, as some of you know, those flights into North Vietnam and bombing runs against the Ho Chi Minh Trail were carried out by A-6E intruder aircraft and also F-4 Phantom jets. And I had the pleasure just in this last year of listening to 2 different speakers in this room who were pilots during Vietnam on the A-6Es. Those daily bombing runs usually lasted for about 12 hours. Flight ops lasted about 16 hours a day, and that was nonstop. Once they were online, this particular line period when this incident occurred, they'd been online for 50 consecutive days. And you can imagine not only what the air squadrons were going through, but what the crew members had to do to keep going. And we're talking about sailors that sometimes were 6 hours on, 6 hours off around the clock for weeks. And I talk about the stresses of that with regard to the incident that later occurred. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reasons that we had those interracial confrontations, but one of them that certainly was a factor was the stresses of what those young men were going through. And I make this comment in the book: why don't we bring thousands of young men of different ethnicities and backgrounds together under these conditions, most away from home and family for the first time, and see what happens? What could possibly go wrong? Plenty, as it turns out. Now, for those of you in the military, you know that one of the primary means of dealing with interdisciplinary matters on board either a ship or otherwise are captain's mass. Captain's mass are otherwise known as Article 15s. Well, the captain's mass that were conducted prior to the incident were a large factor in creating the instance and the incident that evening and early the next morning. Captain Marlin Townsend had come aboard just 4 months before the incident, and this very first day on board, he was confronted with a disciplinary matter in which black sailors had attacked a white sailor. And in that instance, he dealt out very harsh punishment. 30 days in the brig, diet of bread and water, busted in rank, and fines. And he announced to everybody that any assaults on board his ship were going to be dealt with in like fashion. The next 2 masts that he had were white sailors assaulting black sailors. He dismissed all charges in the first case, and he imposed a $25 fine in the second case. This is the Subic Bay Naval Base, and for those of you who've been there, that's QB Point, the Naval Air Station on the left. I was just talking to a sailor here earlier who had been at QB Point. And there were 2 more incidents that occurred while the ship was in port. In each case, it was white sailors assaulting black sailors, identified individuals, and in each case, the captain chose not to prosecute, chose not to even bring him before a captain's mast. And as you can imagine, that led to a lot of tension on board and a lot of discussion. This is another shot of the naval base. The foreground is the base, and beyond that bridge to the top is Olongapo City. Many of you are familiar with Liberty Town in Subic Bay. I actually spent just a few weeks at the Subic Bay Naval Base after these cases were over, defending some other sailors at that point. Now, everything that I've talked about set the stage for what happened that evening. It actually began with white Marines assaulting black sailors. Now, your first reaction might be they must have been doing something wrong. Well, they were not. The captain was concerned because of the tensions on board the ship that evening he asked that the Marines take up special stations both on the hangar bay and the flight deck to help protect aircraft. And the Marine captain won up the order, and he decided unilaterally that he was going to disperse any groups of 3 or more black sailors. Not sailors who were causing disturbances, but just sailors that were walking through or assembling any place. And the decision was made not to disperse any white groups of sailors. And that spread quickly throughout the ship, and before long we had the confrontation that I've indicated, in which there were these confrontations that went on for several hours. Now, one thing that is important to remember here is that they never interfered with any of the flight ops, either that afternoon or evening or the next morning. They were very isolated, usually in the aft mess, deck area, and on the berthing compartment. So that's important to remember, because there's a lot of accounts of this that would suggest that this was ship-wide chaos, even a mutiny. One of the books written on this subject called it a mutiny, which it was not. So it was fairly isolated incidents on those 2 decks. Again, as I mentioned before, this was a very one-sided investigation, and we had several black victims, including my clients.
Marv, we got a question.
Yes.
Mark, Nellie Baylor, I was on Coral Sea just prior to that.
Right.
But my question is simply, what were the numbers of black sailors serving on board the Kitty Hawk at the time?
Good question. How many black sailors? There were approximately 300 out of 4,500, 7%, okay? So a very small minority of the total ship. Good question. Yes.
Not being a Navy guy, what is the aft and the berthing area? I'm reading your book now, and it's like I haven't.
Okay. If you start at the flight deck, below that's the hangar bay, and that's where they have most of the work that's being done on aircraft. They get lifted up from the elevators to the flight deck. And below that, you have the mess deck and the berthing deck. Now, officers and so forth are berthed up above the hangar bay at the 03 level, but yes, that's a good question. So we're talking the hangar bay was the first outbreak, and that's when the Marines were assaulting the white sailors who were strictly walking through the area, but the rest of them took place 2 decks below. The mess deck, food, and then the berthing compartments. Cleveland Mallory was one of my clients, and he was assaulted that evening. He was actually locking up the ship's door, and 3 white sailors came down, one carrying a lead pipe, and assaulted him and broke several of his ribs. He tried to report that incident. He thought he could identify the white sailors, and they refused to let him file a complaint, even though at that time they'd already collected over 100 written statements from white sailors. As a matter of fact, and when he tried to make the complaint, the next thing he knew, he was himself charged with assault. And it was a totally bogus charge. And I'll tell you about that very briefly. He went to trial, and during his trial, a white sailor perjured himself, blatant perjury, in claiming that he first knew Mallory and saw him assault another sailor. Despite overwhelming testimony we had, well, for example, the perjurer said he met him in Hong Kong in a bar 3 months earlier. We brought in the division officer who said Cleveland Mallory never went to Hong Kong. He missed that sailing on the ship. As a matter of fact, he got a 2-hour UA for missing sailing the ship, despite the fact that we had an airtight alibi for when the perjurer said that he met him and got to know him. He was still convicted by the judge. Now, we were very fortunate because we had the help of the NAACP. We had primarily JAG lawyers, but we also had civilian lawyers from California, many of them black attorneys, who had been hired by the NAACP, and they had financial resources also to help us. And following that unjust conviction, we were able to hire an undercover agent. He had been a former Marine officer and a former FBI agent, and he went undercover in San Diego, and he befriended the perjurer and got him on tape, secretly taped, admitting the perjury. And those perjury tapes then became nationwide news because the NAACP had press conferences in New York City and so forth to reveal what was going on. Another one of these persons that helped me with the book is Durwood Davis and also Perry Pettis. These two gentlemen I had not met before. Durwood Davis was a defendant. Perry Pettis here was not. But I was able to contact him as I was preparing the book. Another neat thing about preparing the book was the fact that I was able to reconnect with 13 of the JAG defense lawyers and prosecutors. 8 of those were JAG attorneys, and 6 of them were civilian counsel from California. And they helped fill in a lot of the gaps in terms of my book, and I really appreciated that. One of the really cool things that happened just last month, I had never met Perry Pettis or the other 2 gentlemen, spent hours on the phone with them, but last month my wife Nikki and I flew to Indiana to attend a JAG reunion. We have regular JAG reunions of that group from the Kitty Hawk era, and we flew in and out of Louisville, Kentucky, and Perry Pettis happens to be retired and living in Louisville. So connecting up with him was really very special. When the incident was over, all of those sailors were flown into the Naval Air Station there in San Diego. And the next thing that happened, they were put in pretrial confinement. They had been put in pretrial confinement in the brig in Subic Bay and then in San Diego. Now the key word here is pretrial. Not convicted, pretrial, presumed innocent, totally in violation of military law. And they were in pretrial confinement for months leading up to their trial. We took it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we could not get them out of pretrial confinement. Now, what was especially egregious in this case is that fully half of them were in maximum confinement, and half of them were in solitary confinement for months. And you can imagine that. These are presumed innocent sailors. This next statement from my book comes from one of my clients. He had been in solitary confinement for 50 days when this incident occurred, and we finally had his trial. And at his trial, he was finally able to testify about the circumstances of being in solitary confinement. At that particular time, for administrative reasons, his cell was unlocked. And he saw a friend of his, a fellow black sailor, being brought from the regular brig to solitary confinement. And this is his statement. Quote, "I heard him screaming, for me. My friend hollered over to me, said they were ready to bring him back to row 6, solitary. He screamed to me, 'Here they come.' So then I heard a lot of noise and banging. I hollered out, 'Let him go.' Tears filled my eyes, and I felt like black bondage. I feared he needed help, so that's when I went forward to strike the guard. My relationship with him is as close friends. All the guards are white. By black bondage, I mean slavery. That's the impression I had. I got indefinite, row 6. Now that client survived the brig, but another of my clients almost did not. He attempted to hang himself in solitary confinement, and luckily they were able to cut him down in time. It was one of the most egregious of all the injustices perpetrated against those young men. This is the Naval Station Law Center at 32nd Street in San Diego. It no longer exists, as the brig and so forth, as you can imagine, after 50 years. But this was the site of even more injustices. One of the first of those is that the prosecution team, the government, withheld all the investigative reports from us defense counsel. Now that is blatant violation of not only military law, but civilian law. We knew the reports existed, but they refused to turn them over. The convening authority, that is the senior naval officer who convenes the court, made up all sorts of excuses. First of all, he said it had confidential information in it, and then he wouldn't reveal it. Military law allows them, if there's confidential information, to merely black it out. But it took 2 months to get those reports, and we had to go to federal court to get them, again, in violation of law. And during that time, we had several of the young men had been convicted. And 3 of them would have never gone to trial if we had seen the records, because those records showed that the government witnesses were totally dishonest and had changed their testimony from their original investigative statements. Now, the positive thing that happened with Cleveland Mallory was the fact that we eventually got his conviction reversed when those perjury testimony came forth and was made public. And at that point, the Navy was so embarrassed by it all that they finally let the remaining prisoners out of the brig even before their trials. At that point, there were fewer than 10 that were still in the brig because the rest of the trials had already taken place. Now this is a fellow I don't recognize, but anyway, I put that up there because I was more than a little personally involved in these cases. The convening authority, for those in the military, that's the person who literally convenes the court. He happened in this case to be the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station at San Diego. He thought I was being a little overzealous in my defense of my clients, and perhaps I was. But anyway, he told me he was going to have me removed as defense counsel. This is even before the trial started. And the triggering event for that was I got one of the NAACP civilian lawyers flown out to the Kitty Hawk as it was transiting back to San Diego. And he said that was a violation of regulations in letting a civilian aboard that carrier. Well, he threatened that he was going to have me removed as counsel, and in response, I brought a motion to have him removed as the convening authority. And I had ample authority for that, because convening authorities have to be scrupulously fair and unbiased. Well, he wasn't able to remove me as defense counsel. I wasn't able to remove him as convening authority, but that set the stage for our relationship from then on. And it even reached the point that he tried to have me court-martialed for conduct unbecoming. And cooler heads prevailed, and that didn't happen either. This is a law center courtroom, very small courtroom, relatively speaking, but we had national coverage, coast to coast. Question?
I'm surprised that the convening authority was the commander of the air station. Wouldn't it have been higher than the commanding of an admiral? Like,
right.
I'm surprised.
The question is whether or not there should have been a more senior officer that might have been the convening authority. Well, this is an interesting mix of how it happened. The initial convening authority was Captain Townsend, the captain of the ship. He's the one that made the initial decision to charge only black sailors. But because of the fact he had a conflict, he was actually personally involved, witnessing a lot of things. We were successful in getting him removed as convening authority because he clearly was not unbiased. There was even a so-called threat against him. And then the convening authority became the Subic Bay Naval Base commander because they thought they'd try them there. But because the sailors, almost to a man, had asked for civilian counsel, that meant coming back to the States, and that's when he became. But I don't have a good answer for you why it wouldn't have been above the level of a captain in terms of that. So we went through 3 different convening authorities, and we ended up with the one. Exactly, right. But anyway, the coverage was coast to coast, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and daily TV coverage. One of the very positive things, if you read my book, is that you'll find out we had some very good outcomes. And the result was just the tenacity that we had and the help that we had and the trust we had in our clients. When those perjury tapes became public, all of a sudden, many government witnesses were not quite so sure about their identifications. And they were concerned about themselves being found guilty of perjury. And so many of them, even before the trials started, backed off. As a result, we had 7 outright dismissals or acquittals. And another positive thing that happened, even though virtually all of them were charged with rioting, only 2 of them were convicted of rioting. It's pretty significant when you think about it. Again, that had to do with the fact that the government cases started crumbling when we started pushing back, and we had the benefit, like I said, of those secret tapes and a lot of other stuff that was going on at the time. And another very positive thing, question, Jack?
Yeah, on the other talk that you gave, that I mentioned the captain, but this time you mentioned the fact that there was the sailors, the white sailors were changing their testimony.
Correct.
From the original. Were any of the white sailors then charged with perjury or any other inciting the riots themselves?
No, there was only one exception. The question was, were anybody else charged with perjury? And the question, and the answer, the simple answer is no, because they were pulling back literally the day of the trials. I had 2 clients who were facing their trials, and in each case, the sole government witness, this is right after the tapes became public, decided they weren't sure of their testimony, and charges were dropped. So no, we had no other cases of that. We did have one case months later of a single white sailor being charged, and he was summarily acquitted. There was no reason why they gave for why they brought charges months later, but I had brought a motion called selective prosecution, and the Supreme Court says you cannot selectively prosecute people based on race, and they clearly were doing that. And at that point, the Navy decided, this is toward the end of all the trials, we're going to bring charges against one white sailor. And it was basically charges that couldn't be proved, and he was summarily acquitted. So there was one white sailor charged, but with no reaction. But on the most part, question.
Were any or all of the black sailors dismissed from the service?
Great timing for that question.
Dishonorably
Yes.
or otherwise?
Not a single dishonorable discharge, not a single bad conduct discharge. My client, Cleveland Mallory, got a bad conduct discharge, but his case was reversed when the perjury tapes became public. Everyone left with honorable discharges. As a matter of fact, easily 10 of them were given an early out. Some of them had only served a year, 18 months, and went home with an honorable discharge. And the primary reason for that is because by this time, the publicity about all of this stuff happening had turned the tide in terms of national press and so forth. And they realized that there was a lot of stuff going on that should not have been going on. And I think the Navy at that point, the publicity had gotten so bad for them that they started releasing these people. Now, one thing we couldn't do, and I mentioned that in the book, we couldn't give them back those months of pretrial confinement. That was one travesty that was never corrected. But yes, very positive outcome with regard to that.
Another question.
Yes.
Did anyone reaffiliate later on with another service or go on to serve in any capacity with
None of them that I'm aware of. Very few stayed in because almost all were given this option of getting out because of the Navy's embarrassment about everything. Perry Pettis, the one sailor that I met in Louisville last month, Louisville, Kentucky. He actually stayed in. He was never charged. He was a victim of 2 different brutal assaults, which were never investigated. And he was on the flight deck. And he stayed in. As a matter of fact, he had another carrier. He was aboard the first nuclear carrier after that incident. But I think that might be the sole exception. I couldn't say that for sure about all 25 of them, but I think that pretty much ended all of their Navy careers at that point. One of the things I talk about, yes.
Yeah, I hate to get into the weeds, but there's a lot of classifications of discharges.
Right.
When you say honorable, there's also general under honorable conditions
Yes.
and so forth.
Yes. General under, I should explain this for the non-military. General under honorable conditions is something they were doing in the late 60s and 70s for people who were involved with drugs. Some of you may remember that. They were given a chance. The Navy didn't want them, and they didn't have enough to actually give them bad conduct discharges, so they would give them general under honorable conditions. That's a good point that you make. But no, these were all under honorable conditions, not general. They were not administrative discharges. They were the regular discharges that all you veterans eventually got. At the end of the book, I reflect on a lot of the incidents that occurred and of that particular time in place. And one thing I have to say, and I want to emphasize this, I am not speaking about the present military. Some of you folks here know much more about the present military and whether or not discrimination still exists. What I'm giving in a book is a snapshot in time. I can tell you a 6-month snapshot in time and what happened and so forth. And I reflect on that, not on the present day military, but at that time. And here's what I say in the book. Well-meaning people of all ethnicities, all beliefs, and all persuasions who would never for a minute consider themselves to harbor any racial or other prejudices are a product of their environments, upbringings, and life experiences. As such, they can hold prejudices without any inkling of how their statements or actions may come across to others. In those situations, which may never manifest themselves overtly, their true character and feelings are revealed. And I make that point because it was an important revelation for me during this period of time. And many of you remember Admiral Zumwalt. He was a larger-than-life, youngest chief naval operations ever appointed in his early 40s. He was actually appointed in 1970, 2 years before this incident. And as a result of the Kitty Hawk incident, and 3 weeks later, an incident on the USS Constellation, a sister ship that some of you will remember, in San Diego Harbor, 120 black sailors refused to return to the ship while it was berthed in San Diego, over many of the same complaints of discrimination and prejudice in the Navy. Well, those two made national headlines, and that's what led to the Congressional subcommittee. But it also really got Admiral Zumwalt going. He had come in, and one of his strong goals as Chief of Naval Operations was to get rid of discrimination in the Navy. And as a result of these two, he really won up that. And I have a couple quotes from the book from Admiral Zumwalt. The first is this: "It is self-deception to think that the Navy is made up of some separate species of man, that Navy personnel come to us fresh from some other place in our world, that they come untainted by the prejudices of the society which produced them. They do not." And the other thing he did following these two incidents is that he called together senior admirals in Washington, D.C. for a special, they called it a dressing down, and here's what he said. He issued an unprecedented order telling all commands that in effect their careers may depend on how quickly they move to improve conditions for the growing number of blacks now serving in the fleet. Never one to mince words, he stated that he invites Navy officers who do not view improved race relations as their critical duty right now to retire from the service. Now, I've talked to more than one of you. Go ahead.
Was that Admiral white or black?
Zumwalt was white. Admiral Zumwalt was white. Right. No, it's a good question. Yeah, Z-grams. You remember the Z-grams. Anyway, I think what's interesting, I've talked to 3 of you here in the last few months who told me they remember following the Kitty Hawk and Constellation events, you had to attend mandatory classes on discrimination. The career people have told me that. I don't remember that. Of course, I was going through the trials, but you had to attend those classes. So there were some positive outcomes from all of this, despite all that happened. And the other thing, as I've mentioned, I am not making an indictment of the Navy or the military. What I am doing is making a very strong indictment in my book about certain individuals in the Navy. And this is the statement I make early on, just to make that clear. Quote, "I was honored to wear the uniform of a U.S. Navy officer and am proud of and eternally grateful for those who have worn military uniforms in defense of our country." You'll read about some of them here. There are others, however, whom I have less respect for, and you will read about them also. I witnessed racial injustice up close and personal while representing the Kitty Hawk sailors. My defense of those sailors remains to this day the most challenging and emotionally charged experience of my entire legal career. Now, the book has only been out. Question?
I was just wondering if this discrimination not only involved blacks, but other, like Asian Americans or Native Americans.
There was no indication of that in all of my records, of that extending beyond the black sailors. It probably had to do with the fact that only the black sailors were charged.
Well, I meant that in a general sense.
I understand exactly, but I don't have a perspective for that. Now, of course, the first part of my book is written in the third person. I wasn't there. I'm constructing all of this from all the records I had, and of course the trials I went through, we were going through what was happening on board on a daily basis. But the rest of the book is first person, but I can't answer that question.
One of the big terms back in the 70s and 80s was root cause analysis. Are you aware of any root cause analysis that was done of this event or the surrounding events?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I devote a whole chapter to that. Because the investigators, the Congressional investigation in particular, asked virtually everyone what caused this, what contributed to this. And the quick answer is the discrimination, the one-sided mass, the one-sided dispersal of only black sailors, and the fact that they were not prosecuting white sailors for assaulting black sailors. But yes, I do examine, and that was a good question. I have been encouraged, it's only been a month, but I've been encouraged by the responses I've gotten so far. Well, the book jacket has some nice reviews on it, and we're starting to get some nice reviews on Amazon and Goodreads and so forth. One of the things I'm most proud of, question?
Yeah, what comes to mind is the role of the Navy's division officers. As we all know, there are layers of leadership.
Right.
And if the division officers of these black sailors, did they attempt to intervene when they saw these injustices being committed of their sailors? Because you own your sailors
Right.
if you're a division officer, and you're concerned with their well-being, whether they're white or black.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if
Okay.
any of that.
Well, basically the question is lower level, we're talking about in the Navy, petty officers, chief petty officers, JGs and so forth. Unfortunately, they did not have any role to play in this because all of the injustices were being conducted and led by Captain Townsend. He was the one that gave the order that we're not going to take statements from black sailors. So we actually had some black investigators on board, chief petty officer level, MAAs, and in that case, they were not allowed to take those statements, yes. And as far as junior officers, again, they didn't have the clout to change anything. I have plenty of quotes from junior officers, all the way from JGs to lieutenants to lieutenant commanders, who are just abhorred what was happening and made statements to that effect about the one-sided. Yes, they made statements but could not affect the outcome.
Was there segregation aboard the ship?
Segregation aboard the ship, it was in berthing compartments. As a matter of fact, they said that's part of what they thought contributed to it, because sailors were allowed, so long, when you're first on board a ship, you're given a berthing compartment relatively close to where you work, but they were free then to, white sailors or black sailors, to gather together and change their racks so that they were, relatively close to each other. So there was de facto segregation, but not official, obviously, right? But the Vietnam Veterans National Organization put out a very nice review of the book recently. MilitaryHistoryNow.com is a website that gives exposure to military books, and they wrote a very nice review and synopsis of that recently. I've just been notified that there's a military podcast called Point of the Spear, as some of you may be aware of. Robert Child, he's an East Coast military author who interviews authors of military books, and he's asked to do an interview with me. There's a couple of possible documentaries. One of them we've been notified by the Smithsonian TV channel. They have a series called Combat Ships that they might do a documentary on the incident in my book. And probably the thing that I'm most proud of to date is the fact that I've been contacted last month by the U.S. Naval Academy, and they've invited me to come out to Annapolis early next year to give a talk similar to this to 1,100 senior class midshipmen. And that's going to be a special time for me. Yes?
I know what happened to the captain's career.
Yes, the last chapter of the book. You guys are asking exactly the right questions. The last chapter of the book, where are they now? Okay? And both the captain and the XO, incidentally, the XO, Commander Cloud, was a black man. Okay? Unfortunately, he was one of the heroes of the evening. He was doing more to break up this violence than anybody. But both he and Captain, both their careers were effectively over. To give you an idea, the XO of a carrier, distinguished aviator, should have become captain of his own ship. His next assignment was heading up the ROTC department in Texas A&M University. Think about that. And the captain never captained another ship, and he never made admiral. So, at least in his case, there was some justice that was done. Of all of the question.
Yeah, a question about Captain Townsend coming. How much time did he have coming into the command?
He was only on board for 4 months. Is that your question?
But I mean, prior to that.
Oh, prior to that, Captain Townsend had his distinguished career. He got all the medals you might imagine, and so forth. He had flown during the Korean War, and he had been in senior positions in Westpac over air wings and so forth. As a matter of fact, he was the first commanding officer of the Top Gun School at Miramar in California. He had a very distinguished career.
So he was post 1949 then? Or
yes, yeah. His first duty, I think I'm remembering this correctly, was flying off carrier during the Korean War.
Okay.
All right.
The other thing was, what was the basis of the Congressional inquiry? I mean, who spearheaded that?
Well, it was done because of the publicity that had already come out about the incident, because several papers and so forth called it a mutiny, and they had to get to the bottom of that. And it was back-to-back with the Constellation, with a sit-down strike by 120 black sailors. So that's what prompted it. Unfortunately, they were not interested in getting both sides.
Right. I was just wondering how you could,
Right.
again, well, I think I told you my interest was public relations.
Exactly, right.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Just a point of interest, captains of aircraft carriers all have to be aviators. So their career basically has been flying airplanes. And they would get their qualification by first being a captain of an oiler. So they call it the deep draft qualification.
Okay.
So they've always been affiliated with the aviation part more than driving ships.
Right.
And, it's, you know, it's an interesting aspect of how the
Yeah.
structure is in aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
What happened to the convening officer?
His career went on. He made Rear Admiral's second half, lower half. He was not, there was no ramification for him. Jeff?
Yeah, I just want to, I do have the book. And I just met Marv. I've talked to Marv several times on the phone. Can everyone hear me? I have to wear this mask. But it's a good book for all of those out there saying, gee, when am I going to get my spouse for Christmas? Right? Instead of socks.
Okay.
Book. It's a really good story.
Okay.
I don't get a commission, but my neighbor, who's an LSU graduate, told me about this book, and I thought he was talking about Alabama. Right? And then being an Army guy, I was like, oh, okay, I'll take an interest. It's a very good book. It's very well written. And
Okay.
Mark, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Question?
It seems to me that you proceeded in your work here with a sense of equity and fairness, justice. I'm wondering, as a white kid from a white state, small Midwestern state, whether you had that sense of justice and equity as you came into the military, or whether it developed through this case.
The quick answer to that is I had that sense of equity early on. In South Dakota, I grew up in a small farm in a farm community, and we were next to the Rosebud Indian Reservation and the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. I had classmates and friends, a fraternity brother at college who were American Indian, Native Americans. And I saw what was happening, including in my home state. We didn't have black people in South Dakota. I can almost flat state that at the time. But we had several Native American reservations.
Just another point, I was in the 60s on destroyers, and there was kind of discrimination in rates. Blacks were mainly assigned to steward's mates
Right.
or service rates, mess cooks, laundrymen, as opposed to the more technical rates. So there was some, I don't know whether you'd call it discrimination, but you know, there are the steward's mates, which are the people that took care of the officers, were either blacks or Filipinos, and never a white.
Right. Well, that is very true, but I touch on it very briefly in the book because whole books have been written about that. But one of the pushbacks you'll get from the Navy on that is that at this particular period in time, they were having trouble meeting their standards for recruitment, and so they lowered the standards for the test scores coming in. And then, of course, you had to take another qualification test once you were in. So that was their pushback. They're saying, well, but these young black men weren't meeting the same standards. But yeah, I don't really delve into that, but that's a good question.
The Army had that same issue
Okay.
very much, and we had McNamara's 100,000, where we, accepted a large number of recruits who did not meet the normal levels you would want.
Sure.
This is across the board. It wasn't just blacks that the standards were looking for. It was across the board, which created problems
For everybody.
For everybody.
Yeah. Say, Mike, would you pick up one of those coupons? One of the things that if you attend one of these talks, the publisher is given a 30% discount off of the book. I thought I had to plug my book, but Jeff has already done that. So, but anyway, 30%. Yeah. But if you order the book directly from the publisher, and the other thing is that Amazon, interestingly, has just put the book on another discount, about a $5 discount off of the list price. So either Amazon or that.
I also had ordered it and got a 30% discount.
Oh, you did? Okay. But you can just pick up one of those cards if you're interested. You only need the code. You don't need the card per se.
We'll have it in our library, too.
Okay. Yeah.
Marv, I'm curious, did you feel threatened as you were going through this process, the legal process? And I'm wondering, post-process, did this affect your career?
Not at all. But I was a reserve officer, mind you. I was not career. I've been asked by more than one person, military, would you have acted the same? Would you have been so aggressive? Would you have been tried to remove the convening authority and all the things that we did if I had been a career? And I hope to God the answer is yes. I would have done the same. But yes, I did not feel threatened in terms of the career. I never intended to make it my career. But it was very real at the time, the possibility. That convening authority had the authority to take me off the cases. And it only happened because some of my superior officers pushed back on it, and of course, there was never a court-martial.
Well, did it affect your later career then as a lawyer?
Not at all.
Did it advance you, or?
No, well, I can't say that. Well, what I can say is this, is that when you are in the Navy JAG Corps, you walk in the law center and the next day you're in court. That does not happen for civilian lawyers. Some of them wait years to see the inside of a courtroom,
Sure.
but we are in the courtroom every day. So the real positive that I bring from my Navy service is, first of all, the honor of serving, the friends that we made. We have these regular JAG reunions, and the fact that I got a running start in terms of litigation, which is what primarily I ended up doing. Okay, well, thank you all. Appreciate your coming.
Thank you for joining us
Thank
and
you.
sharing it. And I want to give you one of our challenge class.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
thank you. That
Thank
was
you, Mike.
marvelous.
Yeah, thank you.
So please come visit some more. It's a little bit after 11.